Turn from backsliding. 1 Samuel chapter 29. There may be times and seasons when a follower of God is found in a position of spiritual compromise. The term backslidden has been used to refer to a believer who has fallen into sin after coming to the knowledge of the truth. David is found in a compromised and backslidden place in 1 Samuel chapter 29. We can all remember that young David who slew a Philistine giant for cursing the God of Israel and threatening his people. On that day, the army of Israel encamped against the army of the Philistines, and David boldly entered the valley to fight Goliath. That victory was the catalyst to David's fame in Israel. But now David was encamped with the Philistine army, ready to fight against the army of Israel. How did David end up allied with the enemy, ready to fight against God and his people? We know that David had been fleeing from Saul for a long while. We know that David was patiently waiting to take the throne as king of Israel. But as David waited for Saul's death, at the risk of his own, it seems that discouragement and impatience was setting into David's heart. We can be sure there was probably some pride mixed in there too. David had lost a friend in Jonathan, and he made a new friend with Achish, the king of Gath. Achish is a picture of the enemies that try to be our friends. The Christian has three enemies: the world, the flesh, and the devil. These deceitful friends all try to pull us away from our friendship with Jesus. David was allied with the enemy and was failing to recognize how far he had fallen. David didn't acknowledge his compromise, but interestingly, his enemies did. The Philistine commanders were shocked to find Hebrews in their ranks. Achish boasted about his friendship with David, saying that David had deserted Israel and had become an ally. The Philistines didn't trust David and believed that he would turn on them in battle, and rightfully so. The commanders quoted that well-known rhyme about David killing the Philistines by the 10,000s. Achish reported back to David that the Philistine commanders would not let him or his men fight. Instead of coming to his senses, David pressed the issue. God was giving David endless opportunities to see his sin and to turn back from his backsliding. God was keeping David from what would have been a terrible sin, fighting against God and the people he was destined to rule over. God had a plan for David, and his current position of backsliding was not going to keep him from it. However, this would certainly cause unnecessary pain and consequences. David did retreat, but he wouldn't acknowledge his backsliding and come to repentance until he saw the pain and consequences that his compromise would cause. 1 Samuel chapter 30. If you currently find yourself far from God when you used to be near, then you have backslidden. If you have allied with the deceitful enemies of your flesh, the world, and the devil, you need to come to your senses. Heed the warnings and convictions. The truth is, God has not moved, but you have. And confession and repentance is your way back to close fellowship with God. Start by recognizing that you have backslidden. Then agree with God that your sin is doing damage all around and turn back to God. Begin to walk with God again, even if it be through the pain of consequences for your sin. Our merciful God may even spare you the consequences because he is a true friend of sinners.